The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone was frozen in disbelief, their gazes locked on Officer Karen Whitmore, a well-known police officer in the community. She stood before Judge Marcus King, her face twisted in arrogance as she spat out the words, "People like you don't deserve to wear that robe." Gasps erupted from the courtroom, and a murmur rippled through the stunned crowd. Judge King's expression was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet fire. "Officer Whitmore," he began, his voice firm yet measured, "do you realize what you've just said?" Karen smirked, crossing her arms. "I said what everyone else is too scared to say." The tension was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. All eyes were on the judge, waiting to see what he would do next. But before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A deputy rushed in, breathless. "Your Honor, there's been an incident." Karen whipped her head around, her confidence wavering for the first time. Judge King motioned for the deputy to continue, but his sharp gaze never left Karen. "It involves Officer Whitmore." "Sir, you'll want to see this." The deputy handed the judge a sealed folder, his hands trembling. Judge King opened it, his face growing darker with every passing second. The room was electric with anticipation. "Officer Whitmore," he said finally, his voice now like steel, "I suggest you prepare yourself. This," he held up the folder. "This changes everything." Karen's smirk faltered completely as the courtroom erupted into chaos. It had all started 2 days earlier when Karen had pulled over a black man driving an expensive car in the affluent neighborhood of Crestwood. The man, who introduced himself as a lawyer, politely asked what the reason for the stop was. Karen's tone was condescending as she demanded his license and registration. "Someone like you doesn't belong around here," she muttered under her breath, though it was loud enough for him to hear. The lawyer, who happened to be Judge Marcus King's younger brother, remained calm despite the obvious insult. He handed over his documents and asked again for the reason behind the stop. Karen accused him of having a broken taillight, but when he asked to step out and check, she snapped, "Stay in the car, or I'll have you arrested for resisting." The situation escalated when Karen forcefully dragged him out of the vehicle and called for backup, claiming he was hostile and uncooperative. The lawyer stayed composed, insisting that he was doing nothing wrong. Several neighbors recorded the incident on their phones, but Karen didn't seem to care. She only let him go when another officer arrived and recognized the man, realizing who he was. The footage from that incident had gone viral overnight. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing, had doubled down on her actions, making dismissive comments about the lawyer and the neighborhood he didn't belong in. Unbeknownst to her, Judge King had seen the footage and recognized his brother immediately. Though furious, he maintained a professional demeanor, determined to handle the situation in court where Karen would face charges of misconduct. When Karen was called to court, she didn't expect Judge King to preside over her hearing. As soon as she walked into the courtroom and saw him sitting on the bench, her bravado kicked into overdrive. She sneered, made snide remarks under her breath, and rolled her eyes during the opening statements. Things took a darker turn when Judge King revealed that her actions weren't isolated. He had received multiple complaints about her behavior over the years, but none had reached his desk until now. Karen was defiant. "You think you're better than me because you sit up there in that fancy chair," she spat. "You don't intimidate me, Judge." The room collectively held its breath. Judge King's face was a mask of calm, but his voice carried an unmistakable edge. "Officer Whitmore, your contempt for this court is duly noted. But let me assure you, the law is not blind to your actions." As the deputy entered with a folder containing damning evidence, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Karen's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure, trying to brush it off with a laugh. "What, you're digging up old news now? Pathetic." Judge King's gaze pierced her. "Old news or not, it's relevant. And the consequences will be swift." Karen's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her bravado finally starting to crack. The courtroom was still reeling from the tension when Judge King stood, clutching the folder tightly in his hands. His commanding presence silenced the murmurs instantly. "Officer Whitmore," he began, his voice low and controlled, "you have not only brought disgrace upon your badge, but you have also put this entire judicial system under scrutiny. Your actions, as outlined here, will not go unaddressed." Karen's lips tightened, but the smug expression on her face hadn't fully disappeared. "With all due respect, Your Honor, You're blowing this way out of proportion. The judge's gaze sharpened. Deputy, lock the courtroom doors. The deputy hesitated for only a moment before following orders, the heavy click of the lock sending a ripple of unease through the room. Karen's eyes widened. What's the meaning of this? She demanded, her voice laced with defiance. I believe in transparency, Judge King replied. Let's all take a moment to review the contents of this file. The room buzzed with whispers as he handed the folder to the court clerk, who began distributing copies of the documents and images inside. Karen's confidence crumbled as she caught a glimpse of the top page, a report from an internal investigation she thought had been buried years ago. This isn't fair, she muttered, her voice shaking slightly. This is a witch hunt. Fairness, Officer Whitmore. Judge King's voice cut through the air like a blade. Perhaps you should have considered that when you racially profiled innocent citizens, falsified reports, and abused your authority. The clerk displayed one of the documents on the courtroom's projector, a series of complaints filed by both civilians and fellow officers over the past decade. Each highlighted Karen's pattern of misconduct, including instances of excessive force, racially charged remarks, and cover-ups. The murmurs grew louder, with some spectators shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's bravado had completely evaporated, and her face was now pale. This is ridiculous, she stammered. Those complaints were never proven. Only because you manipulated the system, Judge King countered. But the evidence in this folder, and the recordings submitted by the public, tell a very different story. The courtroom's tension reached a boiling point when the projector displayed a video clip from the viral incident with Judge King's brother. The footage showed Karen yanking the lawyer from his car, her voice dripping with hostility as she barked orders. What are you doing in this neighborhood, huh? She sneered on the recording. You think driving a nice car makes you better than me? The lawyer's calm and measured responses only highlighted Karen's aggression. The room watched in stunned silence as the clip ended with her calling him a punk in a suit before storming back to her patrol car. Karen sat frozen in her seat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. That was taken out of context, she mumbled, but no one was listening. The events that led to this moment had been building for years. Karen had grown up in a family of law enforcement officers and was taught to see the world in black and white, us versus them. She thrived on the power her badge gave her, but over time, that power corrupted her sense of duty. She'd had several close calls in the past, a teenager she falsely accused of theft, a couple she harassed for loitering in a park, and a fellow officer who reported her for misconduct but later recanted under mysterious circumstances. Each time, she managed to escape accountability, either through connections or sheer intimidation. But her arrogance reached new heights after her interaction with Judge King's brother. Instead of reflecting on her actions, she bragged about putting him in his place to her colleagues at the precinct. It was her downfall. Back in the courtroom, Judge King leaned forward, his hands resting on the bench. Officer Whitmore, do you understand the gravity of your actions? Karen didn't respond. Her mind raced as she tried to come up with a way out. She had always been able to talk her way out of trouble, but this time felt different. The weight of the evidence was too overwhelming. Your silence speaks volumes, the judge said. You have consistently shown a lack of respect for the law you swore to uphold. But most importantly, you've undermined the trust of the community you were meant to protect. Before he could continue, there was a loud knock on the locked courtroom door. The deputy hesitated, then unlocked it to reveal another officer standing outside. He was visibly shaken. Your Honor, the officer said, addressing Judge King, we just received urgent news. It's about Officer Whitmore. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the officer handed a small flash drive to the judge. Karen's face turned ashen. She knew what it was before he even said the words. This drive contains new evidence, security footage from a traffic stop 2 years ago. We believe it's relevant to these proceedings. Judge King nodded and signaled for the clerk to load the footage onto the projector. Karen shot to her feet, her voice rising in panic. You can't do this. This is a setup. Sit down, Officer Whitmore, Judge King ordered. The truth will speak for itself. As the first frame of the footage flickers onto the screen, showing Karen stepping out of her patrol car. Her hand rests on her holstered weapon, her posture rigid with aggression. The courtroom is silent, every eye glued to the screen, bracing for what comes next. The courtroom was utterly silent as the footage began to play. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 2 years prior, And the scene was eerily familiar. A quiet suburban street, a young black man pulled over in a modest sedan, and Officer Karen Whitmore stepping out of her patrol car with a swagger that practically oozed arrogance. The room watched as Karen approached the driver's side window. Her body language was aggressive from the start, her hand hovering dangerously close to her weapon. "License and registration," she barked, not even bothering to explain why she had stopped him. The driver, a college student named Jamal, complied immediately, his hands trembling as he handed over his documents. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Karen demanded, her tone sharp and accusatory. I live here," Jamal stammered. "Is there a problem, officer?" Karen scoffed, flipping through his paperwork with exaggerated disdain. "A problem? Yeah, the problem is punks like you thinking they can just cruise around wherever they want." The gasps in the courtroom were audible, but the footage only grew worse. Karen ordered Jamal out of the car and began searching his vehicle without consent. When Jamal protested, she grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him onto the hood of the car. "Stop resisting," she shouted, though Jamal was clearly doing no such thing. The footage ended with Karen driving away, leaving Jamal visibly shaken and humiliated on the side of the road. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators shouted angrily, while others murmured in disbelief. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her face pale as a sheet. This wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. "Officer Whitmore," Judge King's voice thundered above the noise, silencing the room instantly. "Is there anything you'd like to say about what we've just witnessed?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was cornered, and she knew it. "Let me remind you," the judge continued, "that you are under oath. I suggest you choose your words very carefully." Karen finally managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was taken out of context." The crowd erupted again, this time in derisive laughter. Judge King raised a hand to restore order. "Context," he repeated, his tone icy. "The only context we need is what's been presented in this courtroom. Your pattern of behavior speaks for itself." The day leading up to this moment had been a whirlwind for Karen. After the initial hearing where she disrespected Judge King, she had gone back to the precinct, fuming. She was convinced she could still spin the situation in her favor. She made calls, trying to rally support from her colleagues, but to her shock, many were hesitant to back her up. "You've gone too far this time, Karen," one officer told her. "You've made enemies in all the wrong places." Her confidence began to waver as she realized how isolated she truly was. But Karen was nothing if not stubborn. She doubled down, showing up to court the next day with the same defiant attitude that had always carried her through before. But now, faced with irrefutable evidence, her bravado was crumbling fast. Judge King leaned forward, his eyes boring into Karen. "Officer Whitmore, this is your chance to take accountability. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Karen clenched her fists, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to deny, deflect, and defend. But deep down, she knew there was no escape this time. I was just doing my job," she muttered weakly. "Your job?" Judge King's voice was sharp. "Tell me, Officer Whitmore, when did harassing innocent citizens become part of your job description?" Karen had no answer. The judge turned to the audience. This court is not just about punishing wrongdoers, it's about restoring faith in justice. Officer Whitmore's actions have eroded that faith, and it's up to all of us to hold her accountable. He turned back to Karen. "Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending the outcome of this trial. Furthermore, I am recommending that your badge and gun be permanently revoked." Karen's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do that." "Watch me," Judge King replied coldly. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the session, Karen's world began to spin. But before she could fully process what had happened, the doors to the courtroom flew open once again. This time, it wasn't a deputy or another officer, it was Jamal, the young man from the video. He stood in the doorway, flanked by reporters and cameras. "I want to testify," Jamal announced, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I've waited 2 years for this." Karen slumped back into her chair, her face a mask of terror, as the courtroom buzzes with renewed energy. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Jamal stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Karen stared at him, her expression shifting between disbelief and panic. She hadn't seen Jamal since that day 2 years ago, and now, here he was, standing tall in front of a crowd eager to hear his side of the story. Judge King gestured for silence, his gavel coming down hard. "Order! This courtroom will remain respectful and orderly." Jamal approached the witness stand, his movements deliberate and steady. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him, but his determination was unshakable. After he was sworn in, Judge King turned his attention to him. "Mr. Harris," the judge said, addressing Jamal, "you've requested to testify regarding your encounter with Officer Whitmore. You may proceed." Jamal cleared his throat and began. 2 years ago, I was driving home from a study group. I was excited because I just aced a big exam, and I couldn't wait to tell my mom. But then, out of nowhere, Officer Whitmore pulled me over. I didn't know what I'd done wrong. The courtroom listened intently as Jamal recounted the details of that day. He described how Karen had approached his car with hostility, how her tone had made it clear she didn't believe he belonged in the neighborhood. He talked about the fear that gripped him as she ordered him out of the car, twisted his arm behind his back, and threw him onto the hood. "I kept thinking, this can't be happening," Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. "I kept asking myself, what did I do wrong? Why is this happening to me? But no matter what I said, she didn't care. She treated me like I was a criminal." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding the eyes of everyone in the room. The spectators were riveted, hanging on Jamal's every word. As Jamal continued his testimony, he revealed how that single encounter had changed his life. He spoke about the sleepless nights, the anxiety that followed him everywhere, and the way his confidence had been shattered. "I used to think that if I just followed the rules and worked hard, I'd be okay," Jamal said, his voice filled with quiet anger. "But that day, I learned that sometimes, it doesn't matter what you do. People like Officer Whitmore will always see me as less than." His words hit the courtroom like a punch to the gut. Even Judge King's composed expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to disappear. She could feel the weight of every stare, every ounce of judgment directed at her. Her usual bravado was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. After Jamal finished, Judge King addressed him. "Mr. Harris, thank you for sharing your story. Your courage is commendable, and this court recognizes the harm you've endured." Turning to Karen, his tone hardened. "Officer Whitmore, do you understand the depth of the damage you've caused? This isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about a pattern of behavior that has left a trail of pain and distrust." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Jamal interrupted. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I have evidence." The courtroom erupted once more, the air thick with tension. Judge King gestured for quiet, his interest piqued. "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "I recorded the whole thing. I didn't know if I'd ever need it, but something told me to keep it, just in case." Karen's face went pale, and her hands trembled slightly. "That's illegal," she blurted. "He can't just record a police officer without permission." Judge King's gaze was sharp. "Officer Whitmore, I suggest you remain silent unless spoken to. Mr. Harris, please hand the drive to the court clerk." The tension in the room was palpable as the clerk loaded the footage onto the projector. The screen flickered to life, and the grainy video began to play. The angle was low, clearly recorded from Jamal's phone, which had been propped up discreetly on his dashboard. The room watched in stunned silence as the events of that day unfolded in vivid detail. Karen's aggressive tone, her unnecessary use of force, and her blatant disregard for protocol were all on full display. But the most damning part came near the end of the footage, when Karen, thinking no one was recording, muttered to herself, "Another thug off the streets. One less problem to deal with." Gasps filled the courtroom. Karen's head dropped, her face flushed with humiliation. There was no escaping this. The footage had laid bare not just her actions, but her mindset, a toxic mixture of prejudice and abuse of power. When the video ended, the room fell silent. All eyes were on Judge King, whose expression was unreadable. He turned to Karen, his voice low and steady. "Officer Whitmore, Do you have anything to say in your defense? Karen was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky and uncertain. I didn't mean it like that. It was taken out of context. The judge's gaze hardened. Context? The context is crystal clear, Officer Whitmore. Your actions and words speak for themselves. Judge King stands, his gavel in hand, as he prepares to deliver a ruling that will change the course of Karen's life forever. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Judge King stood, holding the gavel firmly in his hand. Karen's face was a mask of panic, her composure completely shattered. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp the gravity of her situation. Officer Whitmore, Judge King began, his voice steady but brimming with authority, your actions, as presented in this courtroom, are not just a violation of your duty as an officer of the law. They are a betrayal of the trust placed in you by the public you swore to protect. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Judge King raised a hand to silence her. No more excuses. No more deflections. The evidence is clear, and your behavior is indefensible. The gavel came down with a resounding crack, silencing any lingering murmurs in the courtroom. This court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and racial profiling. You are hereby placed under formal investigation, and your badge and firearm are to be surrendered immediately. The courtroom erupted into a mixture of applause and chatter. Karen's face drained of color as two deputies approached her, their expressions neutral but firm. One extended a hand toward her badge, the other toward her holstered weapon. "This is ridiculous," Karen muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. "You can't do this to me." Judge King's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Deputies, escort Officer Whitmore out of my courtroom." Karen's mind was racing as the deputies guided her out. For years, she had operated with impunity, confident that her badge would shield her from accountability. Now, her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. As she walked past the gallery, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some were filled with anger, others with satisfaction, and a few with pity. But the most piercing gaze came from Jamal. He didn't say a word, but his calm, resolute expression spoke volumes. For the first time, Karen felt truly small. Outside the courtroom, the reporters were waiting like a pack of wolves. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust in her direction as questions bombarded her from every angle. "Officer Whitmore, do you have any comment on the allegations against you? Do you regret your actions? Will you resign from the force?" Karen ignored them, her jaw clenched as the deputies escorted her to a waiting car. But the chaos wasn't confined to the courthouse steps. Inside her mind, a storm was brewing. The days that followed were a blur for Karen. She was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, her name splashed across every news outlet. Former colleagues distanced themselves, and community leaders demanded her immediate termination. Karen's home became a prison. She avoided going outside, knowing the public outrage against her was only growing. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from reporters, others from people hurling insults and threats. But the worst blow came when her father, a retired police captain, called her. "Karen." His voice was heavy with disappointment. "What were you thinking?" "Dad, it's not what it looks like," she tried to explain. "The media's twisting everything." "Stop," he interrupted sharply. "I've seen the footage. All of it. There's no twisting anything. You messed up, Karen. Badly." His words stung more than she expected. For years, her father had been her biggest supporter, the one who encouraged her to follow in his footsteps. Now, she could hear the regret in his voice. "You need to own up to this," he said finally. "Because if you don't, it's only going to get worse." Karen hung up without responding, her hands trembling. For the first time, the reality of her actions was beginning to sink in. Meanwhile, the community was buzzing with activity. Jamal's testimony and the footage from his encounter with Karen had sparked a wave of protests and calls for reform. People gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "End police misconduct." Jamal found himself thrust into the spotlight. News outlets wanted interviews, advocacy groups reached out for partnerships, and strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for his bravery. But despite the newfound attention, Jamal remained grounded. He wasn't interested in fame, he just wanted justice. "I'm not a hero," he told a reporter during an interview. "I'm just a guy who got tired of being treated like less than a human being." Back at the courthouse, the investigation into Karen's past was uncovering more skeletons. Former victims came forward with their stories, each one painting a damning picture of her career. A young woman detailed how Karen had falsely accused her of shoplifting, an elderly man recounted being harassed for jaywalking, and a former officer described the toxic environment Karen had created at the precinct. It was becoming clear that Karen's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Karen sits alone in her dimly lit living room, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her phone buzzes with a notification, a news alert about the protests outside the precinct. Her eyes flicker to the television, where a reporter is interviewing Jamal live on the scene. His calm, determined demeanor is in stark contrast to her current state. As the camera pans to the crowd, Karen spots a familiar face, one of her former colleagues, holding a sign that reads "Accountability for all officers." Karen's breath catches in her throat as the realization hits her. She's not just fighting for her reputation anymore. She's fighting against an entire movement that demands she pay for her actions. She grips the arm of her chair, her mind spiraling, as the sound of protesters chanting grows louder on the screen. She sat motionless in her darkened living room, the chants from the protest on the television growing louder as the camera panned across the crowd. The words "justice for all" and "accountability" now filled the air, each syllable chipping away at her already fragile composure. She reached for the remote and turned the TV off, plunging the room into silence. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, another notification lighting up the screen. It was yet another news update about the growing unrest, but Karen couldn't bring herself to read it. Instead, she stared at the blank television screen, her mind replaying the moments in court when the video footage had been played, exposing her in the harshest light. She thought back to her father's words, how he had urged her to take responsibility. But the idea of admitting fault felt impossible. Karen had spent her entire career projecting strength, confidence, and authority. To admit she had been wrong meant unraveling everything she had built. At the precinct, the mood was equally tense. Officers whispered in break rooms, carefully avoiding any mention of Karen in front of their superiors. Captain Reynolds, the precinct's commanding officer, was holding an emergency meeting in the briefing room, addressing the fallout from the scandal. "This is a stain on our department," he began, his voice heavy with frustration. "Officer Whitmore's actions have put us all under scrutiny, and the public is demanding answers." Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen had her allies, but even they were beginning to distance themselves from her. One officer raised his hand. "What's going to happen to her, Captain? Is there any chance she can come back from this?" Captain Reynolds shook his head. "That's out of our hands now. The investigation is being handled by Internal Affairs, and from what I've seen, the evidence isn't in her favor." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. Meanwhile, Jamal was navigating his newfound role as a community advocate. After his court testimony, he had been approached by several civil rights organizations, all eager to collaborate with him. But Jamal was cautious. He didn't want to become a pawn in anyone else's agenda. During a meeting with one organization, he voiced his concerns. "I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm not here to be a figurehead. This isn't about me, it's about changing the system." The group's leader, an older woman named Linda, nodded thoughtfully. "We understand, Jamal. And we agree. But you have a platform now, and that gives you power. Use it wisely." Jamal left the meeting feeling conflicted. He had never intended to be at the center of a movement, but the support he was receiving was impossible to ignore. People believed in him, and that belief was starting to inspire something new within him: hope. Back at Karen's home, the pressure was mounting. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense man named Gerald, was pressing her to come up with a strategy for the upcoming hearing. "You need to be honest," Gerald said, leaning forward in his chair. "If you keep denying everything, you're only going to dig yourself into a deeper hole." Karen scoffed. "You don't get it. Admitting fault means throwing away my career. My reputation." Gerald's expression hardened. "Karen, your career and reputation are already on the line. This is about damage control. The evidence against you is damning. If you don't show some accountability, they'll make an example out of you." Karen's stomach churned at the thought. She had always seen herself as untouchable, someone who could weather any storm. But now, she was beginning to realize that she had underestimated the consequences of her actions. As the days passed, the protests outside the precinct grew larger. Community leaders joined the crowd, calling for reforms and demanding accountability not just for Karen but for the entire department. Karen watched the news coverage from her living room, feeling increasingly trapped. The public's anger was palpable, and it was clear that she had become the face of everything they despised about the police. One evening, as she sat scrolling through her phone, she came across a video clip of Jamal speaking at a rally. His words were calm yet powerful, resonating deeply with the crowd. "This isn't about one bad cop," Jamal said. "It's about a system that allows people like her to operate without consequences. We're not just asking for justice for me. We're asking for justice for everyone who has been mistreated, ignored, or silenced." Karen felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but it was close. For the first time, she began to wonder if Jamal had a point. There's a knock at Karen's door. Startled, she hesitated before getting up to answer it. When she opened the door, she was met with the last person she expected to see, Captain Reynolds. "Can I come in?" he asked, his expression serious. Karen stepped aside, her mind racing. "What's this about?" Reynolds didn't waste any time. "I'm here because you need to make a choice, Karen. The investigation is closing in, and it's only a matter of time before they bring formal charges against you. But there's a way to make this easier, for you and for the department." Karen's heart pounded as she stared at him, waiting for him to continue. "I'm offering you a chance to resign," Reynolds said. Quietly. "No trial, no public spectacle. But you need to decide now." Karen stands frozen in her doorway, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a heavy fog. Karen stared at Captain Reynolds, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. His offer echoed in her mind: resign quietly, avoid the trial, and save herself from complete humiliation. It was a way out, but it felt like a trap. "You want me to walk away?" Karen finally asked, her voice low and tight. "After everything I've done for this department?" Reynolds didn't flinch. His face remained impassive, his tone professional. "This isn't about what you've done for the department. It's about what you've done to it. The evidence is piling up, Karen, and it's not looking good. If you resign now, you can save what little dignity you have left." Karen's stomach twisted. She had always seen herself as untouchable, a pillar of strength in the department. The idea of leaving in disgrace, with her tail between her legs, was almost unbearable. "What if I don't resign?" she asked, her voice challenging. Reynolds sighed heavily. "Then you'll face the full weight of the investigation. You'll go to trial, and everything will come out. Every complaint, every report, every video. You've seen the protests, Karen. The public won't let this go." Karen's jaw clenched. She didn't respond, and Reynolds took that as his cue to leave. He handed her a card with the department's seal on it. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," he said, stepping back toward the street. "But think carefully. This is your last chance to control the narrative." Karen closed the door slowly, the card feeling heavy in her hand. For the first time, the reality of her situation felt crushingly real. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Meanwhile, the protests outside the precinct showed no signs of slowing down. Jamal had become a central figure in the movement, his voice inspiring others to come forward with their stories. At one rally, an older man named Mr. Jacobs took the microphone and shared his own encounter with Karen. "I'll never forget the day she stopped me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I was walking home from the store, and she accused me of loitering. When I tried to explain, she told me to keep walking or else. She treated me like I was nothing." The crowd erupted in chants of support for Mr. Jacobs, their voices rising into the night. Jamal stood nearby, his expression solemn as he listened to yet another story of injustice. Back at her house, Karen was spiraling. She had always prided herself on being tough, on never letting anyone see her sweat. But now, she felt like she was unraveling. She hadn't slept in days, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the people she had wronged. Her lawyer, Gerald, had called earlier, urging her to prepare for the possibility of a trial. "You need to think about a plea deal," he had said. If this goes to court, they'll tear you apart." Karen had brushed him off at the time, but now his words lingered in her mind. A plea deal meant admitting guilt, something she had sworn she would never do. But what other options did she have? The next morning, Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the resignation card Captain Reynolds had left. The deadline was approaching, and she still hadn't made a decision. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. She glanced at the screen and saw her father's name. Reluctantly, she answered. "Karen," he said, his tone stern. "I've been watching the news. Have you thought about what you're going to do?" "I don't know, Dad," she admitted, her voice unsteady. "Reynolds wants me to resign, but I don't know if I can do that." Her father sighed heavily. "Karen, listen to me. You've made mistakes, big ones. But dragging this out won't make it any better. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is the right thing." Karen bristled at his words but didn't argue. Deep down, she knew he was right. The fight she had clung to for so long was slipping away, and the harder she tried to hold on, the worse it got. At the precinct, the investigation into Karen's actions was reaching a boiling point. Internal Affairs had uncovered a series of incidents that painted a damning picture of her career. Each report, each complaint, each video was another nail in the coffin. One of the investigators, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Martinez, spoke with Captain Reynolds about the findings. "This isn't just about Officer Whitmore," Martinez said. "It's about the culture that allowed her to operate unchecked for so long. If we want real change, we need to address the bigger picture." Reynolds nodded grimly. "One step at a time, Detective. Right now, we need to deal with Whitmore." Karen stands outside the precinct, the resignation card in her hand. She looks up at the building, her emotions a chaotic mix of anger, fear, and regret. Inside, she knows that Captain Reynolds is waiting for her decision. As she takes a deep breath and steps toward the entrance, the sound of protesters chanting grows louder behind her. Their voices echo in her ears, a haunting reminder of everything she has lost. Karen paused at the doors, her hand hovering over the handle, as she prepares to make the most difficult decision of her life. She stood at the precinct doors, her hand frozen on the handle. The chants from the protesters behind her grew louder, their voices blending into a steady, relentless roar. The resignation card felt like a lead weight in her pocket, a symbol of everything she was about to lose. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The cool, sterile air of the precinct greeted her, and the familiar faces of her colleagues glanced her way. Some quickly looked away, avoiding her gaze, while others stared with thinly veiled judgment. Karen squared her shoulders, forcing herself to keep moving. Captain Reynolds was waiting for her in his office, the door slightly ajar. He looked up as she stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Karen," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Have you made your decision?" Karen hesitated, her heart pounding. She sat down but didn't speak right away, her mind racing through every possible outcome. Finally, she pulled the resignation card from her pocket and set it on the desk. "I'm not signing it," she said firmly. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You're sure about that?" Karen nodded, though her voice wavered as she spoke. "I'm not walking away like this. If they want to take me down, they'll have to do it in court." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "You realize what that means, don't you? The trial will be public, and everything, every complaint, every report, every piece of evidence, will come out." "I know," Karen said, her jaw clenched. "But I'm not going to let them force me out without a fight." Reynolds sighed, a mixture of frustration and resignation in his eyes. "Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you." News of Karen's decision spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of it. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, speculating about the upcoming trial and what it would mean for the broader movement against police misconduct. Jamal, now a central figure in the protests, was asked for his thoughts during an interview. "I'm not surprised," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "People like her rarely take responsibility for their actions. But this trial isn't just about Karen Whitmore, it's about holding the entire system accountable." His words resonated deeply with the public, and the protests grew larger, drawing people from all walks of life. The movement was no longer just about Jamal's case. It had become a rallying cry for justice and change. As Karen prepared for the trial, her lawyer, Gerald, pressed her to reconsider her stance. "You need to think about taking a plea deal," he said during a tense meeting. "If you go to trial, the odds are stacked against you. The evidence is overwhelming." "I'm not pleading guilty," Karen snapped. "I've worked my whole life for this career. I'm not going to let them take it away without a fight." Gerald sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Karen, this isn't about your career anymore. This is about the truth. And the truth is, you made mistakes, big ones. If you don't acknowledge that, the jury won't have any sympathy for you." Karen glared at him, but deep down, his words hit a nerve. She didn't want to admit it, but she was terrified of what the trial would bring. The first day of the trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and activists, all eager to witness the proceedings. Karen sat at the defense table, her expression carefully neutral, while Jamal took his place among the witnesses. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They presented damning evidence, including the viral video of Karen's encounter with Jamal, the recording he had made, and testimonies from other victims who had come forward. Each piece of evidence chipped away at Karen's defense, leaving her feeling more and more exposed. Jamal's testimony was the most powerful moment of the day. He spoke with quiet strength, recounting his experience with Karen and the lasting impact it had on his life. "I don't hate her," Jamal said, his voice steady. "But I do hate what she represents, a system that sees people like me as less than human. This isn't just about me. It's about all the people who have been silenced, ignored, or mistreated." Karen avoided his gaze, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: shame. After the first day of the trial, Karen returned home, her mind racing. The prosecution had built a strong case, and she knew that her defense was on shaky ground. But she couldn't bring herself to admit defeat. As she sat alone in her living room, the sound of protesters chanting outside grew louder. She peeked through the curtains and saw a sea of people holding signs and chanting slogans. One sign caught her eye: "Change begins with accountability." Karen's breath caught in her throat. The words lingered in her mind, stirring a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. She sits in the dim light of her living room, the voices of the protesters echoing through the night. For the first time, she begins to question not just her defense, but the person she has become. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror the next morning, staring at her own reflection. Dark circles lined her eyes, and her usually sharp features looked worn and haggard. She barely recognized herself. The trial had only just begun, but it felt as though years of her life had been drained away in a matter of days. Her phone buzzed on the counter, another barrage of notifications from the news, messages from her lawyer, and updates from the precinct. She ignored them all, her focus fixed on the day ahead. Today, her defense team would present their case, and Karen knew it was her last chance to salvage what was left of her reputation. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation when Karen arrived. The public gallery was packed, and the energy in the room was electric. Jamal sat with his lawyer, his demeanor calm but resolute. Karen avoided looking in his direction as she took her seat at the defense table. Gerald leaned over, his voice low. "Remember, Karen, stick to the facts. Show remorse, but don't overdo it. The jury needs to see you as human, not defensive." Karen nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She had spent years projecting authority and confidence, but today, she felt anything but in control. The defense began by attempting to shift the narrative. Gerald argued that Karen's actions, while flawed, were a product of the high-pressure environment she worked in. He painted a picture of a dedicated officer who had been overwhelmed by the demands of her job. But the prosecution was quick to counter. They brought up Karen's history of complaints and misconduct, presenting it as evidence of a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. Each new detail felt like a dagger, and Karen could feel the weight of the jury's judgment growing heavier with every passing minute. The defense's final move was to have Karen take the stand. It was a risky strategy, but Gerald believed it was their best chance to humanize her. Karen walked to the witness stand, her steps measured but hesitant. She was sworn in and took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. For a moment, she felt like she was drowning under the weight of the stairs. "Officer Whitmore," Gerald began, his tone gentle, "can you tell us about the day you pulled over Mr. Harris?" Karen swallowed hard, her voice shaky as she began to speak. "It was a routine stop. At least, that's what I thought at the time. I didn't handle it the way I should have." She paused, glancing at the jury. Some of them looked skeptical, others neutral. No one appeared sympathetic. "What do you mean by that?" Gerald pressed. Karen hesitated. She knew what she needed to say, but the words felt foreign on her tongue. "I let my emotions get the better of me. I didn't treat him the way I should have. I made assumptions, and those assumptions were wrong." There was a murmur in the courtroom, but Karen pushed through. "I thought I was doing my job, but looking back, I can see how much harm I caused. To him, to his family, and to the community." For a brief moment, Karen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her words would make a difference. Then it was the prosecution's turn to cross-examine. They wasted no time dismantling Karen's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies and highlighting the systemic nature of her actions. "Officer Whitmore," the prosecutor said, their voice sharp, "you've claimed that your actions were a result of stress and poor judgment. But what about the other complaints filed against you? Were those also just poor judgment?" Karen faltered. I don't have an excuse for those." The prosecutor leaned in. "No excuse. Yet you continued to act in the same way, over and over again. Isn't that right?" Karen's silence was deafening. As the day wore on, the weight of the evidence against her grew insurmountable. Karen returned to her seat at the defense table, her mind racing. The trial was slipping away from her, and she knew it. During a break in the proceedings, Gerald pulled her aside. "You need to prepare yourself," he said quietly. "The jury isn't on your side." Karen nodded numbly. She had fought so hard to hold on to her pride, her career, and her identity as an officer. But now, she was beginning to see the truth. She had been wrong about everything. That evening, Karen sat alone in her home, staring at the resignation card Captain Reynolds had given her. It felt like a cruel reminder of the choices she hadn't made, the path she hadn't taken. She reached for her phone and hesitated before dialing a number she had memorized during the trial. The line rang twice before Jamal's voice answered. "Hello." Karen's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Jamal, it's Karen Whitmore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Jamal finally spoke, his tone was cautious. "What do you want?" Karen took a deep breath. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that." Jamal was silent for a moment. "You should have thought about that 2 years ago," he said finally. "But if you're serious about making amends, then start by being honest, with yourself and with the court." The line went dead, and Karen sat staring at the phone, Jamal's words echoing in her mind. Sitting in the dim light of her living room, the resignation card in one hand and her phone in the other. For the first time, she feels the weight of accountability settling over her, and she knows that the final part of her story is about to unfold. The courtroom was silent as Karen sat at the defense table, her head lowered. Today was the final day of the trial, and the tension in the room was palpable. The jury had deliberated for hours, and now they were returning with their verdict. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as the foreperson stood, holding the small slip of paper that would seal her fate. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge King asked, his tone calm but firm. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. Karen gripped the edge of the table, her palms sweaty. She tried to keep her face neutral, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to hide. Gerald placed a steadying hand on her arm, but even he looked resigned. The foreperson cleared their throat. "In the matter of misconduct, abuse of power, and racial profiling by Officer Karen Whitmore, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted into noise. Some people cheered, others cried, and a few simply nodded in silent agreement. Karen's shoulders slumped, the weight of the verdict crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Judge King brought the gavel down hard, silencing the room. He turned his gaze to Karen, his expression unreadable. "Officer Whitmore," he began, "this court finds your actions not only reprehensible but a betrayal of the public trust. Your behavior has caused harm that extends far beyond the individuals you targeted. It has eroded the very foundation of our justice system. As such, this court sentences you to 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 3, and permanent revocation of your law enforcement credentials. Karen's mouth fell open, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. When the reality sank in, she whispered, "Your Honor, please." Judge King held up a hand, cutting her off. "This is not about you, Officer Whitmore. This is about justice. The system you abused will now hold you accountable." The gavel came down again, and the trial was over. As Karen was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, she caught a glimpse of Jamal standing with his family. His face was calm, but there was no triumph in his eyes, only quiet determination. Their eyes met briefly, and Karen felt a pang of regret so sharp it nearly took her breath away. Months passed, and life in the community began to change. The trial had sparked widespread conversations about police reform, and the precinct where Karen had worked implemented new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power. Officers underwent additional training, and a civilian oversight committee was formed to ensure transparency. Jamal became a leading voice in the movement for justice. Though he still carried the scars of his encounter with Karen, he used his experience to advocate for others who had been silenced. His work inspired real change, and the community began to heal. In prison, Karen had a lot of time to reflect. The badge she had once worn with pride was gone, and with it, the identity she had clung to for so long. For the first time in her life, she began to question everything: her beliefs, her actions, and the person she had become. One day, she wrote a letter. It was addressed to Jamal. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read. "But I want you to know that I see things differently now. I see the harm I've caused, and I'm sorry. I don't know if that means anything to you, but I needed to say it." She mailed the letter, unsure if he would ever read it. The story ends on a hopeful note. The community, though still grappling with the pain of the past, is on a path toward healing and accountability. Jamal stands at the forefront of a movement for change, his voice echoing in the hearts of many. And Karen, though far from redemption, has begun the difficult journey of confronting her own flaws and seeking to understand the damage she has done. For the first time, she is no longer running from accountability. She is facing it head-on. Because sometimes, the most important step toward justice isn't the verdict, it's the change that follows.